And for more on what's unfolding in Cuba, I'm joined by Michael Kergin. He served as Canadian ambassador to the Republic of Cuba from 1986 to 1989 and as Canadian ambassador to the U.S. from 2000 to 2005. He is now a senior advisor at Bennett Jones. Mr. Kurgan is in Ottawa. Michael Kergin, welcome to the show.
Happy to be with you, David.
So these protests like this in Cuba are rare, perhaps even unprecedented. What are your thoughts on what's happening in the country right now?
It is, David, it is unprecedented. I think the last time you had such a uprising, or at least a protest, if you will, was probably during the Marielle period, maybe about 35, 40 years ago. What's new here is social media and the fact that Cubans now have access to the internet and to smartphones so they can rally across the country. So before that, you had localized pockets in Havana itself. But now we're looking at, protests in Santiago and Holguin and other provinces, and fairly well orchestrated by the social media. Secondly, the Cubans are really suffering. They've had a spike in COVID recently, but more importantly, economically, they're doing very badly. The tourist business has completely been shut off, almost completely shut off as a result of COVID. And that was a really big foreign exchange earner for them, and also a source of employment for many Cubans, since they had opened up a little bit into the private sector, small restaurants and et cetera. And on top of that, David, Venezuelans, of course, are in bad shape, and the Venezuelans had been providing pretty cheap oil to the Cubans. The Cubans have no real energy on the island itself, and so that has kind of dried up, as well as their markets for China. So it's been kind of a perfect storm. Fidel, the Castros have gone. There's new management there. Doesn't have quite the same charisma as the Castros did. So all these things coming together, I think, suggest to me that we're going to see more of this and maybe increasing amounts of it as we go forward in the next couple of weeks. Yeah,
it is quite a volatile cocktail of factors as you lay out all of the various ingredients that are coming into play there. I'm wondering, though, Mr. Kurgan, if you can give us your thoughts on sort of the reaction from the big players in this hemisphere. President Biden, for example, he expressed solidarity with the protesters. The U.S., no fan of the Cuban regime. But the Canadian government called on both sides to exercise restraint. What do you think of the difference in the reaction from the U.S. and from Canada?
Well, for the Americans, it's a very tricky situation. We always used to say about Cuba, with respect to the United States, that Cuba is not an international policy problem, it's a domestic policy problem. Because you've got the Cuban diaspora in Florida and in New Jersey, both very critical states in the political spectrum of the U.S., and to some extent, the Cuban lobby, which has been very anti-Castro, has been very effective in swinging or causing to swing Florida to move Republican. So that's much of a contested state. So one, for the Democrats, they want to be very careful. They lost votes there in the last election, the presidential. And so they're a bit on eggshells, and they don't want to upset that group. Not to speak of the Venezuelans, exiles in Florida, who also tend to be quite right wing. Mm-hmm. So that's on that side. And then on the Canadian side, we've always been very even-handed with Cuba. As you probably know, David, we were the only country, along with Mexico, outside of the Soviet bloc that never broke relations with Cuba. Most of Latin America did, all of Western Europe. Early days of Castro, we provided a lot of food aid and agricultural support to the Cubans. So we've had a very long history, and we were the first tourists to Cuba. When I was there in the 80s, the Canadians were about the only ones who were in Cuba. Most of the people were worried and didn't want to go to the communist country, but Canadians had long-standing relationships in Veradero and other parts of Cuba. So the government here has a rather different approach, both historically. I mean, Trudeau's father, you might recall, met with Fidel Castro and spent some time in Cuba. And he was the first NATO prime minister, head of government, to visit Cuba by quite a long shot, as a matter of fact. So we're in a very different position from the Americans. And I must say, just as an editorial comment, that U.S. policy of sanctions against Cuba has really just not worked. I've always felt that if the Cubans are very entrepreneurial people, we know that we see how the exiles are in the United States, that if the embargoes had been dropped, the sanctions had been dropped, I'm quite sure that the Castros would have been swept away quite early. But here's a superpower 90 miles off, a country of 11 million people, very oppressive as the Cubans see them. And of course, those 11 million Cubans tend to rally around the flag or around Fidelismo. So it's consolidated the ideological solidarity that the Cubans have had with the socialist regime there. So my own view of this is that the Biden administration really should move a little bit to where Obama was and gradually open up a little bit, while at the same time criticizing the human rights abuses, of which there are many, the lack of democracy, the lack of an open and accountable justice system.
How likely do you think that is, though, sir, that kind of a shift from the U.S.? Because domestic politics is what it is, right?
It is what it is. And you might remember there was a big effort back in the day when Obama tried it. Even before that, Clinton tried to open up a little bit, and it got swamped by a problem with an exiled kid from Cuba. So it's very difficult for the American politically. And as I say, it's my predecessor in Washington, Alan Gottlieb, always said that a special interest group will trump a general interest group every day. And I think there's something to be said with that when it comes to Cuba.
I wonder, though, if you look at what is happening there, and if it really is a consequence of sort of oppression and poverty and COVID, when the Canadian government calls on both sides to show restraint, I mean, is it really a both sides issue in this situation? I mean, the state certainly would be the side that would need to exercise a greater level of restraint, would it not? So I just wonder, why do you think the Prime Minister and his officials have chosen this particular choice of words?
Well, it's hard to know. I mean, one has to be a little careful, because if you push too hard on sort of supporting the people against the government, you get into slightly dangerous, and I'm speaking like as an old diplomat, I guess, slightly into the question of regime change, which is, of course, not where you want to go. And the issue here, and I think where pressure should be put on in private conversations with the Cuban government, is lay on a pretty heavy message to act with restraint. We'll have to see how the new president handles this, but the early indications are not tremendous. And of course, the secret police are pretty pervasive in Cuba. But again, we have to be very careful, because, what proportion of the Cuban population at this point is really ready to go out on the street? I don't know. That's something to be seen. And that's where I think it's good to watch this over the next week or so. And if you see more and more people coming out, protesting peacefully and so forth, then I think our message starts to have to modulate a little bit and provide a little bit more support for those people. But right now, I'm not entirely sure how widespread, although it's certainly, in my view, somewhat unprecedented to see these people out on the streets.
Okay, Michael Kergin, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.